I mentioned to a couple people before most of you came in, I have a very informal sign-up sheet here. Uh, it's official, yes. I did not do any handouts because I have tons. And I figured it'd be easier just to email them to you. So if you would like me to email you a packet of information, please put your name on there, either now or after or whenever, totally fine. And I will email you a whole bunch of stuff as well as a copy of this presentation if you like. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Aimee Swenson. I am doing small-scale sheep and goat production. I've been teaching off and on about sheep and goat production for many, many years, many moons. I'm a producer. I own Overland Lamb, which is now located in Stockbridge. And I produce full-purpose sheep, meaning I do meat, wool, breeding stock, and the whole shebang, and value-added. So I've done some goat production in the past. I am not a goat expert. I can refer you to goat experts if you so choose. But I have raised goats. I've also raised pigs and chickens, but we're not talking about those today. So sheep are my thing. I'm a third-generation producer. So third-generation producer, second-generation sheep and goats. And my mom actually did sheep for working dogs for a very, very long time. And I raised several different breeds. Does anybody in here already produce sheep? No. Is anybody getting into sheep production? Am I only talking to goat people? Uh-oh. Okay, well, I might convince you to raise sheep. Okay, how many of you already have goats? Okay, just one of you. How many of you are getting into goat production? A few of you. Okay. All right. So I will make this as goat-centric as possible. I did try to do it as 50-50 as possible. Often when we do small ruminant education, it does tend to lean to the sheep side, regardless of who does it. A lot of it kind of cross-pollinates, which is why. But I did put some very specific goat production stuff in here for you all, because I had a feeling. All right, so getting started. Now, I want to pretense this whole conversation with the fact that I could probably do 3 days of education on everything. And as I was putting this presentation together and kind of collaborating all my presentations, I thought, oh gosh, this could be an 8-hour conversation. So I really tailored it down. There's some things I did not include, which was like parasite management and kind of the nuances of actually those types of things once you get into goat production. But I can refer you to those resources when we're done so that you have record of who you need to contact for those kinds of things as well. I have that information as well. I will be emailing it to some of you if you give me your email address. So you'll have that information. But if you want like very strict parasite management type training, you can do 2-3 days with MSU Extension and really deep dive into how to do that. But we'll talk just a little bit about that today. So getting started, that's Beatrice. I like to kind of get people started to think about why they want to produce what they want to produce. Do you want to produce sheep because they're cute or goats because they're cute? Do you want them to make money for you? That's the preferable option. I always say that if your animal is not making money for you, they're a hay vacuum or a hay vampire. So I always tell folks, if you have animals, regardless of what they are, they should be making money for you. So even if you don't have a fiber animal, those goats can make money for you. You can contract graze, you can do milk, you can do meat, you can do a lot of different things. So you want to start making that money on your animals and get them to at least start paying for your hay right away. So of course, when you get started, you're going to go out a little bit with some feed. That's nature of the beast, so to speak. There might be a little bit of humor in here today because it's the end of the day, we're tired, right? So there's some puns that have been slipping in. But you do want to make sure that you're setting yourself up to get those animals paying for you as soon as possible, because hay's not cheap, right? And if you're feeding grain, it's even more expensive. So why have you chosen sheep or goats to produce? Do you want to do meat? Do you want to do contract grazing? Do you just want to do pets and have some milk on occasion? You know, what is it about that animal as to why you're choosing it? And then you need to deep dive a little bit further and say, okay, there's 260 some odd breeds of sheep. Each of them does something a little different. So why do you want to choose the breed that you have or that you think you want over another one? Do you want hair sheep over wool sheep? Do you want fiber goats instead of milk goats? Do you want meat goats? So there's a lot of different things that you need to consider as you're trying to pick the breed. Also, you need to take into account your acreage. How many folks already have acreage that they're thinking about putting animals on? Quite a few of you. Okay. Forgive me, I'm going to have to get some water here. I've been talking all day. A lot of folks think that they need a lot of acreage to get started with sheep and goats, and they don't. It's one of those animal categories that you can do at kind of a low scale. I know a gal, she's been producing sheep for over 30 years. She got 2 acres. And she produces and sells 50, 60 lambs a year. And it's the way that she does it, right? So it's very intense. The less land and the more animals you have, the more engaged you have to be, the more hands-on you have to be. But you can do it at any scale, okay? So the scale that really comes into consideration, though, is if you're doing it within city limits, where you have to consider city ordinances, things like that. That can be a challenge for some folks. And I know a lot of cities and towns are working on ordinance changes to get those done so you can have goats in particular inside city limits. But it is a challenge. And it's something that has been active for 20 or 30 years in many municipalities. So think about your acreage. We're going to talk about carrying capacity here in a little bit. Where's your vet? I will tell you, small ruminant vets are few and far between. And if I had to do it all over again, I would be a small ruminant vet. I'm serious. I love doing it. And a lot of producers, a lot of longtime producers end up learning how to do a lot of those kind of medical care things because vet care is few and far between for large animals in particular, and even more so for small ruminants. A lot of folks have specialties in cows and horses and even pigs over sheep and goats. So that's something to consider. If you're getting sheep and goats, you really want to kind of deep dive onto what those diseases are, how to treat them, get a better understanding of what that acute care might be so that you can treat some of those things on your own, or at least manage them on your own, and then have resources if you, for instance, need to put an animal down, right? Having animals, sometimes you have to euthanize. Sometimes, if you don't have a vet, you're going to have to figure out how to do that for yourself, right? So that's a huge consideration. It's on the list for a reason. Feed is another consideration. Are you going to be grazing your animals? Are you going to be buying hay? Are you going to be buying grain? How are you going to produce or acquire the feed that you need for the animals that you want to grow? And we're going to talk a little bit about how much feed you will need for your animals as well. Housing. All sheep and goats should have some sort of housing. Don't feel like you need to have a full-fledged barn to have sheep and goats. You do not need to have a full-fledged barn. You can have a 3-sided shelter that is more than sufficient enough for sheep and goats. You need to start taking into considerations if you have maybe thin-wooled sheep or some of the more desert type of goats than others. You might want a little bit more insulation in that shelter or a little bit more shelter. You can relegate with deep bedding and those kinds of techniques. But you do not need to build a lambing barn or a kidding barn to have sheep and goats. Don't fear. What about a shearer? So I can't tell you how, I was a shearer for over a decade. I cannot tell you how many calls I'd get 6 a.m., midnight, Sunday afternoon. I need a shearer last week. What do I do? Because people get the animals and then they realize, oh, they're awfully woolly and it's June. What do I do? And then they panic. And and then they're in a frenzy trying to figure out who's going to shear their sheep. And this also applies to goats because we have fiber goats as well, right? We have Angora goats. So you need to make sure that you have those resources kind of in your periphery before you start. There are plenty of shearers in the state of Michigan, I will tell you. There's some up-and-coming young shearers. I'm retired, don't call me. But I shear my own, and I'm lucky to do that. But you will have some options, and I can help direct you to that. So I'll give you access to the shearer list, too. Transportation. You can't lead your goats to your house, right? So if you don't have a livestock trailer or something to haul them in, you can often contract with people, borrow. There's actually a couple Facebook pages for livestock transport. The transportation is key. And it also comes into play if you're planning on taking those animals to auction, if you're doing meat production, or just a buyer return on that, or if you're planning to take them to the processor, or if you need to go to the vet and the vet won't come to you, right? So sometimes you can find a vet, but you have to do what they call a haul-in. So you need to take those into considerations. Don't run out. I don't even have a trailer. Don't run out. I've been doing sheep for 30 years. I don't have a trailer. So I kind of co-own a trailer with a friend of mine, and we share it, and we kind of go back and forth. So yes.
I didn't know if you were allowed to ask questions yet.
Sure.
So I was a couple minutes late, but what's the difference, or why would someone choose a sheep over a goat or vice versa?
Well, okay, so her question was, why would somebody choose a sheep over a goat or vice versa? I'll tell you, it's a personal preference. And I would say that 9 times out of 10, you're either a sheep person or you're a goat person. And I have a slide I'll show you later, and there's a reason why. Their personalities are very, 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 very different. Very different. Very different. I attribute goats to being the cats of livestock, and sheep to being the lazy couch dogs of livestock. So pick your poison. But sheep and goat meat taste differently. There's different markets for that meat. Some people will eat goat meat. Some people will eat lamb. And I will say, we'll do a caveat on the lamb too. Lambs are not, you're not eating the tiny little cute lambs that are frolicking on Instagram, right? You're eating, 180-pound yearling lambs. But the meat is different. The fiber is different. The pelts are different. Leather use is different. The whole thing. The way they... The ability to get out is different. The way that they graze is different. So depending on your land will depend on that choice as well. All right, so breed selection, we'll talk about sheep first. These are just a smattering of breeds that we have. That some of them. Yes, I will send you all this presentation. And this is non-inclusive. There's over 250 breeds of sheep, close to 300. Some of them are better suited for our climate than others. I will say, like the barb black bellies, those are tropical sheep, for instance, but there's quite a few in Michigan. Merinos, you hear a lot about merinos. Merinos are a desert sheep. A lot of people don't know that. Merinos are a desert sheep. They actually don't do very well in Michigan. But here's how they kind of break down. We have some wool breeds, some meat breeds, and dual breeds. So wool breeds mean, I say all sheep are meat sheep. Some just happen to have better wool than others. Wool breeds are more focused on wool, meaning that they're produced primarily for wool. But I produce Teeswaters, Romneys, and BFLs, and Finns, and Gotlands. My best meat comes off of my Teeswaters. So they have fiber that's 10 inches long. So it's a specialty fiber. So all wool sheep are meat sheep, but some folks like to focus on wool. So if you don't want to produce wool, if you don't want to produce meat, you only want to produce wool, these are the breeds that you can start looking into, some of them.
So if Teeswater has those qualities, why does everybody grow Teeswater in Michigan?
Well, because they have 10-inch wool, and they're 300 pounds. So, I mean, my Teeswaters stand up this tall on me. Yeah, and they're kind of bullies, right? So that's a personality thing. I really like them. They're kind of loud and obnoxious. And they're beautiful. And like the BFLs, you know, they're a North Hill sheep. They're from the UK. They have the big Roman noses, but they have a thinner wool coat. They have a very thin wool coat, so they actually don't do well in the winter here. For me, I don't like them to get wet and snow on them. I cross them. I cross them with Finns or Teeswaters or something of the like. So for meat sheep, these sheep in italics are non-wool producing. They do not produce wool. They're what we call hair sheep. So a lot of folks that are trying to figure out if they want to do sheep or goats will often do hair sheep as kind of an in-between because they don't want to have to manage the wool and don't want to have to hire a shearer. So Dorpers and Catons in particular are extremely popular in Michigan. In fact, Dorpers and Polypays are some of the largest produced breeds in the state. So if you're wanting to get into meat production, you could start there. Now, each of these has their own nuances, right? Some of them are more parasite resistant than others and vice versa. And then dual purpose sheep are really kind of taking the best of both worlds. They're stockier bodied, they have a medium quality fleece, they're not going to be super fancy, but they can produce nice solid lambs for a large lamb crop. Polypays have that name because they can produce multiple lambs. They're crossed with the Finn sheep, and Finn sheep throw litters. So I've raised Finn sheep for many years. I've had litters of 6. Yeah, so, but they're also like 3 pounds and just obnoxious to take care of when they're little. So that's a trade-off. A boar goat is a desert goat. So a boar goat is a meat goat. We're actually going to get into that here real quick, Vicki. No, actually, they actually do very, very well. The Finn sheep they're one of a heritage breed. They go back several thousand years. They're very used to producing multiples, and they did that because they came from a very cold climate where some of their litter would die in the cold, right? And so they kind of genetically modified to produce more. All right, so breed selection for goats. I don't have as many on here because there's not as many. Not as many really common in the U.S. These are the most common in the U.S. So for fiber goats, you have Angora, Cashmere, and Pygora. So Pygora is a combination of Pygmy and Angora. So everybody knows what mohair is, right? Mohair comes from Angora goats. Angora does not come from Angora goats. Angora comes from Angora rabbits. Yes, sir. Mohair comes from goats. It's goat fiber, and it's really long and shiny. So it comes from an Angora goat. So it kind of throws people off with that name, right? They're not mohair goats, they're Angora goats. So that's where your mohair comes. They're also fairly large, and you can produce those for meat fairly well.
So, I'm sorry.
Yes?
So a Pygora being a pygmy and an Angora means
They're small.
Angora but a smaller version.
They're minis, yes, yes, yep. Yep, fiber is pretty much the same. Yep, yeah. So, so to clarify that, the only thing that produces wool in the world is sheep. Llamas don't produce wool, Angora goats don't produce wool, camels don't produce wool. They produce fiber. So the only thing that produces wool is sheep. Yes. So you have fiber animals, and then you have wool animals. Fiber animals do need to be sheared, yes, unless they're a camel.
So when you shear them,
Uh-huh.
I'm assuming there's a process
There is.
whereby you would have to, or maybe you can help the process by combing them on a regular basis so that when you shear them, that
Nope.
shit ain't gonna work.
Nope. Your shearer will kill you. No, don't wash your animals and don't comb your animals. Please, 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 please. No, because particularly with sheep, they have lanolin. Lanolin comes from sheep only. It's the only animal that produces lanolin. Comes from sheep, and it is like an oil substance, right? And it grows in a lot of the glands on the animal, but it also grows out through the hair fibers. So when you're shearing, that helps lubricate the blades to yes, shear it like butter. It's exactly right. That's what we say. So you shear it like butter. You don't want dry animals. You don't want clean animals to shear. So you wash the fiber after. Yeah. And then there is a process through fiber preparation where they actually comb it out and get it ready for yarn that way.
And is that I can only see it as being tedious.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, how can I say, you can hire someone to do it and pay them $1 million.
I mean, there's some people that might, yeah. Yeah, it is, your shearers are an expense, and I will say that if you are producing wool and you want to use that wool or sell that wool, try to have a market for it, right? If you're going to do wool, try to make sure you have a market lined up for that, because wool in the wool pools, going for 40 cents a pound if you're lucky. It's less than 1950. But you can sell good quality wool to hand spinners. You can sell it on Etsy. You can sell it in, in spinning clubs. I have tons of hand spinners. I have a doll maker that buys wool from me for the doll hair. So, in fact, Teeswater wool is a big one that's used for doll hair, for the ringlets. Oh, that's a whole class, Vicki. That's a whole class. Yeah, we can deep dive into that. That's a whole class, but you can call me on that, okay? Yes.
Is there like a class or something that you can take, like if I didn't want to do wool, but I wanted to do dual purpose, and
Yes.
I wanted to share myself because
Yes.
I'm not sharing
Yes. Yes. So if you want to become a shearer, to either shear your own animals or somebody else's animals and get that fiber. In fact, when I started learning to shear, that's what I did. Is I apprenticed with another shearer, and I went around and helped shear alpacas and llamas and sheep, goats, and a lot of people will throw that fiber away because they don't have a market for it. And by the time, so I used to shear in Arizona, and I was one of only two shearers in the state. And when I left Arizona, I had almost 3,000 pounds of wool in my house that I had to give away because that was what I was collecting from all of my clients that were throwing it away or burning it. Because there's no market. It costs more to get it sheared than it is to sell it in a wool pool. And then you have to find those wool fiber processors. Not always. Not always. So, okay, so we can come back to that in the essence of time. All right, here's your meat goats. How many of you are interested in meat goats? Okay, a couple of you. How many of you are interested in fiber goats? A couple of you. Milk goats. Yeah, a lot of people like milk goats. So, milk goats or meat goats? All goats are meat goats. All goats are meat goats. So, yes. And all of them are browsers. Yes, browsers. Yes, browsers. Yeah. We're going to get to that. I'm telling you, this is like a plethora, right? So
Are sheep browsers too?
no, they're grazers.
Okay.
So we're going to get to that.
All right.
Okay, so here's your dual purpose goats. Those are the most common ones we see in Michigan. My personal favorite is the Nubians. You see them in the background with the big floppy ears. They have wonderful personality. They're less aggressive than like the Alpines and the Toggenburgs. The La Manchas are the ones that don't have the little ears. They only have the little, I call them alien ears. They're very large yield milk producers, La Manchas are. Nubians are also very large yield milk producers. Nigerian dwarfs are nice for the folks that want little goats and still get a decent milk production. So I've raised Nigerian dwarfs for quite a while. They are a high yield goat as well, a high yield milk goat as well.
So now the others, it's not that they don't make milk, they just don't make it as high.
Exactly. So the genetics in these animals here are more prone to milk than anything else. You're going to see these animals with those really big udders, right? Those really big udders. They're throwing, several ounces a day, several.
And what about,
Okay, yes.
And this might be a little bit off, but like what makes goat milk easier for humans to ingest?
There's something about the protein, and I got to be honest with you. Do you know the answer?
I try to answer
Sure.
So the word that I use is globule.
Yes.
Globule size of milk from goats versus milk from cows. A cow, when it's born, that it comes here weighing, 120 pounds, where a sheep gets to 100. In theory, the way it used to be, humans don't get 300 pounds like a cow. So the globule size for a cow is bigger because the animal is bigger, where the globule size for a sheep, I'm going to use this in quote, matches the globule size of a human.
Yep.
So our stomach can break that down a lot better than the globule size this way for.
Yeah, that is very good. And there is a difference in the proteins, and I do have a chart in here that I'll show you later on that shows you the difference in the nutrients between all three types of milk.
So for cheese makers, that's really important.
Yes. All right. So, do you know the most consumed milk in the world? No. No. Yes. 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 All right. So here's the things that you need to consider. Are you doing all of this work with these ornery little animals for personal use or profit? Do you need your animals to work for you? Are you wanting to do this just for companionship? I tell you, there are people that just want goats for companionship. I don't know why, but they do. So here's the difference in how you approach. Here's the difference in how you approach your production based on these two different streamlines. If you're doing it personal, you don't really care about when or how much you're producing, whether it's lambs or kids or milk, right? Like, you're just kind of keeping them there. You have options for your processors. You could really take them anywhere. It's not going to have an impact to your bottom line because you're not worried about resale. You can feed flexibly. Like, for instance, I don't feed corn or soy to any of my animals. So that's my personal preference for market and personal use. But some folks want to only feed organic, for instance. If they have an only organic market, they're going to have to feed only organic feed, right? But if they're doing it for personal use, maybe they can be flexible with that. Yes, sir? You can do whatever you so choose. This is not school. All right, so for personal use, your flock sizes are often smaller because you're not worried about increasing your flock size to meet some kind of market demand or anything like that. You can be a little bit more flexible with your infrastructure. Now, if you're doing it for profit, you need to really dial it in, right? You want to look for what your yields are, how many lambs you're going to produce, how many kids you're going to produce, how much milk you want to produce. Are you going to do a cost share or a CSA on your milk or whatever it might be? And you're going to have your market driven by when you lamb or kid, okay? And that goes for milk and meat. Because there's a market for meat in different times of the year, and the market rate fluctuates. Yes. And it also depends on your market clientele as well. So for profit, you have to use a USDA processor. If you resell that meat, it must be processed by a USDA facility, no questions asked. All right? There is a caveat to that we're going to talk about called custom exempt. But if you are reselling packaged meat, it has to go through a USDA processor, which really declines how many processors you can use. All right? There's only 24 USDA processors in the state. Not all of them are open for commercial use. Not all of them do lambs or goats. Your profit, you're going to really want to dial in your feed and the quality of your feed. And you're going to have to determine your flock size to meet your income needs. All right, understanding land and grazing requirements. This is where we get into a little bit of science. Forgive me, I need a little drink here.
So while you're drinking, you were saying the type of food. So I want to ask, I guess I'm trying to ask, does the USDA in some manner determine that you must feed your animals a particular kind or a mix?
No.
Okay.
No, that is up to you. Now, I always say in production that there is the things that you always have to do, there's the things that you never should do, and everybody else can function in between. So if you're producing sheep or goats, there are things you always have to do and things you never should do. And how you do it in the middle, every single one of us in this room are going to do it different. So that's where it gets a little nuanced, and you can feed the way you want to feed and graze the way you want to graze. But you'll want to do specific things to make sure your animals don't die, for instance. Okay, so here's your daily dry forage intake requirements. Sheep eat approximately 3 to 3.5% of their body weight per day, meaning if you have a 100-pound animal, they're going to eat 3 to 3.5 pounds of dry forage per day. So what I like to do, I'm not that scientific. Now you go to MSU Extension, they're going to get scientific and they're going to break it down. I'm too lazy for that. What I do is I calculate 5 pounds per day per animal because I know that there's going to be waste, right? So if I calculate down to that 3.5% and I'm giving each animal 3.5 pounds a day, sheep are messy eaters in particular. Goats are also messy eaters, not as much as sheep, but there's going to be a loss there. There's going to be probably a 2 to 3% loss. So calculate for that. They pull it out of the feeder, they tromp on it, they poop on it, they sleep on it. That's where your deep bedding comes from, right? Goats will eat a bit more. They need a bit more because they're less picky than sheep. Goats, that's why we call goats browsers. So this is how we classify them. So we have grass, we have weeds, and we have browsing. So you can see these goats up there. They're standing up, they're eating those shrubs. Goats will eat almost anything. Almost anything, okay? What they will not eat, I'm not sure because I've had them eat a shoe. I've had them eat goats. Anything sacred, keep away from your goats. Sheep, all they want to do is put their head down and mow through the grass. They're not going to lift their head, and they're not going to pull off of shrubs. Now, they might tackle some little saplings here or there. They are not going to do that. So this is where one of your land considerations come in, right? So if you have a really shrubby lot, I've had clients that have taken really shrubby lots. They don't want goats, they don't like goats, but they're going to use goats in the beginning. They use goats for the first year, clean out the whole lot, then it's nice and open. They can do some drill seeding, they can get a nice pasture in there, then they put their sheep in there. So think about what you want to do with your land, and that's how you're going to manage it, right? So goats will graze, but you can see here that grass, goats only 20% of the time, generally speaking, will choose grass. Okay, so that's their natural instinct is to not have their head down grazing so much. Okay, they're very exploratory. They're very curious, and they will get. You used to be able to tell on my old property where the goats had been because of how high they could stand on their back legs and trim the trees. So now sheep, you can see 60% of the time they're going to choose grass. They will do a little bit of browsing, maybe 10%, but goats, you can see 60% of the time they're going to want to graze or browse, right? So think about what you have to offer, okay? Neither one of them like weeds that much. You're right. It says, I will say that even though it says that sheep will choose weeds over browsing, I would say yes. But I also say that my goats have always eaten more weeds than my sheep. It's the different kinds of weeds that they will eat. So like my sheep won't touch thistle, but the goats will tear the thistle, and cows will definitely tear the thistles up. So it just depends. So like the autumn olive and all of that, the goats will tear that up, sheep won't touch it. So it just varies. Pokeberry, when I timbered out a portion of my property, I had a lot of invasives come up. I had tons of pokeberry, and the sheep wouldn't eat it for the first 2 years. The goats would nibble at it, and then after that, the goats would leave it alone. And then once the pokeberry became tender enough, the sheep annihilated it, but the goats wouldn't touch it. So, all right. So we're going to talk about animal units and carrying capacity. This is where we learn about your carrying capacity for your land, right? So how many of you have heard of animal units before? A couple of you. Okay, so this is how we calculate how many animals you can have on your land, technically speaking. An animal unit is technically 1,000 pounds, okay? And that's a 1,000 pound animal. It's based on cattle calculations. So 1,000 pounds equals one animal unit. And that's a 1,000 pound animal grazing for 1 month, okay? So it's 1,000 pounds per month on an area of land. Now, sheep don't weigh 1,000 pounds, thank goodness. Goats don't weigh 1,000 pounds, thank goodness. The general animal unit equivalent for sheep is 0.2, meaning 5 sheep per 1 full animal unit. So the carrying capacity of the land for 1 cow can carry 5 sheep, okay? Now that changes a little bit depending on what you've got. Rams generally weigh a little bit more. They're generally larger. If you have larger animals like those big beefy Teeswaters, we might bump it up to 0.25 because there's more of an animal. It is also very warm in here, you guys. So, weaned lambs, the little guys that are 3-4 months out, they're 0.12. They're not eating much. Okay.
Nutrition-wise, because they're still growing, you have a nutritional need.
There is a nutritional need, but the yield of what they're gonna eat is still less than an adult. So it's the actual weight of what they're eating. So technically, 1 acre of dry forage on average per animal unit should be about 780 pounds. And I'm going to get to that here in a second. So what you need to know is how many animals you have or how many you want versus how much acreage you have or how much acreage you want. And that will help you determine how many animals you can have on that property. Each acre with the forage assessment will have an animal unit max per month. So again, that's that 1,000 pounds per animal per month, broken down by species, okay? So I'm gonna go a little bit further here. All right, so if we're looking at stocking rates, this is where we take those animal units and we figure out how much mass we're putting on our land, how much hoof mass we're putting on our land. So this is your stocking rate. So sheep, 500 pounds of animals per acre is what your stocking density is. Goats are 600 pounds per acre for them because they tend to be, goats in general tend to be a little smaller, although they have more of a consumption than goats, right? So they're eating 4 to 4.5%. Sheep are eating 3 to 3.5%, but they actually weigh less. And they're not doing so much of the grazing, dry forage on the ground, right? So they're going to eat less of that. Now, this is if you're doing, I'm going to jump back and forth between the slide here. This is the differences in the grazing. So this is what a lot of folks do. They have an area of land. Go forth, goats. Have a nice day. And they stick them out there. And that's what they do. That's just continuous grazing. Now, when you get into rotational grazing, you're going to take that same area of land and you're going to break it up. And then you're going to rotate them through. You're going to have a certain amount of days per section, right? Now, if you want to get even more in depth, you can break that down even further into intensive grazing. And this is actually what I do. We also refer to this as strip grazing in some instances, and I'm going to show you a picture of that. But as you do this, your stocking rate can go up because you're doing it more intensively, right? So if you're just sticking the animals out here and they're just doing willy-nilly whatever they want, you're going to want to stick closer to that stocking rate, that 5 or 6 animals per acre, because you're not relegating their actual nutrition down to the nitty-gritty. Now, when you're getting over here, you can increase that a little bit because you're moving them in, you're doing some more intensive grazing, they're getting all that nutrition, they're not picking through the weeds, they're not being, I call sheep divas, sheep are divas. They like to eat what they like, and they will not eat what they don't like unless you force them to. So if you have a pasture and there's, a various amount of different forage in there, and the sheep only like the fescue, or they only like the timothy, or whatever it might be, they're literally, in this situation, going to go through and they're going to pick all that out. And then you're going to get these bare spots, and you're going to get this overgrowth of all the stuff that you wanted them to eat, but they didn't eat. You move over to rotational grazing, they're going to be forced to eat more of that. They're also going to be less parasite impacted, right? Because here, all sheep and goats have parasites, 100%. 100%. And there's not a place in Michigan where you're not going to find barber pole. So if you go out, I'll tell you, a barber pole worm, I will tell you, if you go out and somebody tells you they've never had barber pole, it's just because they've never had an animal die of barber pole. Okay? Barber pole is there. It's endemic to the U.S., primarily in these areas where we get warm and wet. It happens. It's your biggest killer of sheep and goats is barber pole. As far as you're going to have more of that here because you're not able to control where they're dropping those parasites, because they might drop a parasite over here and then graze here tomorrow and then come right back here and graze over here again, and then they're going to ingest those eggs.
I would think with a smaller area, they would have less area to move in and they would be more likely.
Well, because they stay here shorter period of time. And there's an egg cycle, right? So with parasites, I told you I wasn't going to get too deep into the parasites, but we have to bring it up. So with parasites, there is a cycle. And so generally speaking, you want to rotate out every 3 days because that is the egg drop cycle, right? So they're in here, they drop the eggs on those parasites, and then you move them over here. You don't want to put them back over here for at least 7 to 10 days.
So they're hatching out without a host.
They're hatching out without a host. So you need them to, quote, die on the vine, basically. So by the time they get back here, those eggs, those larvae are dead. They haven't gone into the animal to host and build. Yes?
Let's say you're just putting goats in rotational grazing, with grazing thing, how long would you wait, like this is your first rotation, and until you put them in the other area?
Very good question. You are smart, young man. How long would you wait, if you had goats here, how long would you wait to put them over here? That's what you're asking. You just put them in there. I would leave them for 3 days. Okay, I would leave them for 3 days, and then I would move them to the next spot. Have them in there for 3 days, move them to the next spot. Now, what I like to try to do, because this does two things, it lets your pasture regrow, and it kills the parasite cycle. So you don't necessarily want to graze that again for at least 18 days in my personal preference, because you need that forage to grow back. So that's why I like intensive grazing, because you can have double the animals in an intensive grazing situation. I'm going to go back to this picture right here. This is what we call strip grazing. So now they've taken it down further than I would ever take it down here, but this is a cover crop and they're able to do that, all right? But you can see there's an electric fence there, and you can see where the electric fence was before. So that electric fence was pulled, they've moved up, they're gonna graze this. There's probably 200 sheep there. They're gonna graze that till it's basically gone. This is a cover crop. You wouldn't do this on your standard forage. They're gonna graze that. They're gonna drop all those parasites, right? And then they're going to move to the next one. And they won't see this until it regrows. So there's going to be no parasites, and you're going to have fresh forage. There should be. You definitely should want, especially like in this instance, you don't need one because it's dirt. But if you do have residual forage on that last strip, you do want an electric fence back there to keep them from going and lounging back there.
Have you ever tried work the chickens at following?
Yes. So you can intersperse chickens after your sheep and goats to clean up the parasites. Ducks do it as well, for those of you that have ducks. Yep. And geese are a really good predator control too. Yes. So definitely. So I know folks that have the tractors, the poultry tractors, and they'll move them behind the sheep. Now they do require different fencing than the sheep. You need the really small electric fencing for them. Okay, so yeah, pretty much. Turkeys will work, yep. Here's a general grazing calculation sheet that you can use. Now you're going to get this so you can use it, right? But this basically tells you how to figure out how much animals you can have, okay? So if your animal unit is a goat and it's 0.15 and you want it there for 1 month, this is how much forage demand on that goat, right? So I've got actually three calculation sheets that I'm going to send you through this so that you can plug in, I have this much acreage, and I want to do this for my stocking density, and you can figure it out. Yes? Goats need, very good question. Both goats and sheep are herd animals, and they need companionship of the same type of animal. You could have goats with sheep, or sheep with sheep, or goats with goats. I wouldn't necessarily recommend putting them with cattle. If you just have one sheep or one goat, don't put them with cattle. I used to shear this one Suffolk sheep named Yoda. He was 400 pounds in Flagstaff, Arizona, and he lived with a donkey, and he was bigger than the donkey. That is the only exception I've seen. But you do want companionship. They need species. I would say a minimum of 3 would be best. All right, so let's talk about housing briefly. So I mentioned already that all you really need to get started is a 3-sided house, and I'll give you some parameters there. This is a hoop house that's been, or a tunnel house that has been converted into a lambing barn. You can see that there's feeders there. You can use a myriad of different things. I will say that this is one of the most efficient systems, and not enough people use it. So if you have a hoop house, you can do veg on one side and sheep on the other. I've seen it. All right, here's your housing and space for sheep. This mostly applies to goats as well. So this is the square foot minimum that you need per animal, okay? Minimum, and your lambing pens should be a minimum of 16 square feet. And that means it's a 4x4. Okay, yes. No worries. I will talk to you later. Good to see you. So your lambing pens should, or kidding pens should be at least 4x4. I would say personally, I like them a little bit bigger. I like 6x6 for mine because that gives them space to kind of move around and bed down. But at least 4x4, that's the industry standard. So this gives you an idea of your spacing requirements, okay? So you guys will get this and you can re-reference it. Goat specific. Goats like to climb. Goats will climb on anything. If they have a ladder to get up in a hayloft, they're gonna do it. They're gonna do it. Goats will get into feeders. This is one thing that drives me bananas. When I have goats living with my sheep, I just wanna like jump off a cliff sometimes because I'll go out there and the goats will be sleeping in the feeders. And the sheep can't eat. Yeah, so now I always was trying to figure out how to do my goat feeding separate from my sheep feeding. Some people do. I couldn't figure it out. But just know that that's a thing. They're going to crawl in the feeders. They're going to crawl on anything. If you have standard like 3-foot pins, they're going to go over that. They're going to crawl right over that whenever they want. Sheep must not have access to goat mineral. Just 1 second, okay? Sheep must not have access to goat mineral, and the reason for that is because goats require copper. Copper is toxic to sheep. So if you have free feed mineral out, do not make sure that it does not contain copper. Oh, great, thank you so much. Some folks have to catch the bus, so make sure that your any copper feed is separate from your sheep, okay? Now, the way that you can get around that is you can feed an all-purpose mineral if you have both sheep and goats that doesn't have copper in it, and then you give your goats a copper bolus once a year, twice a year, depending on the animal, and that way they're getting their copper requirement. It's completely safe from the sheep, okay? You had a question. He's forgot. Okay, we'll come back, okay?
But if I don't want my goats to climb over the fence for any reason, like how high should it?
Probably 5 feet. Probably 5 feet at least. I'm 5'4", so probably 5 feet, but not have things that they can put their feet into to get on there.
Reactive are they to electric?
Very reactive. Electric fencing works amazing for goats.
Does anyone responsibly have a leash on the goat?
Yes, goats are easily lead trained, but you don't ever want to leave a harness or a collar or a leash on any of the animals because they can get strangled being caught in fences and things like that. Here's a really important one. Goats are food dominant with sheep. If you're feeding sheep and goats together, those goats are going to try to steal all the food all the time. Now, they may not win, but it's going to be a constant battle. So just know that. Yeah, especially like if you have pregnant ewes and you're trying to feed your pregnant ewes with your goats and your goats are butting heads with pregnant ewes, trying to get to that feed. I've actually had 2 ewes that have gone into ketosis from lack of feed access because the goats were beating them up. So, uh-oh. All right, so here's your housing best practices. Best practices to if you're having a 3-sided shelter, it's open to the south. If you open it to the north, you're going to get an inundation of snow and rain in there. So open to the south, please. You can curtail your temperature in your housing if you have that 3-sided shelter with deep bedding and cold weather, but you want to make sure that you're removing any saturated bedding. If you get a leak in the roof or you get rain coming in the side, whatever, you want to remove that because straw maintains moisture. Minimum of 25 square feet per animal. Good ventilation at all times. I will tell you, do not shut your barn. Don't shut your barn. Your animals will die of pneumonia. Your animals will die of pneumonia. I keep my barn open year-round unless there's literally a blizzard. Even if it's -20 out, I have one door in my barn open at all times. Unless there is a blizzard where it's blowing in, which has only happened a couple times. You need that airflow to keep the condensation down and that fresh air and ammonia out, okay?
Something like a tarp, kind of hang a tarp.
I would not. I would not. Now, goats are more prone to get cold than sheep because they don't have the wool, right? So in the goat situation, you're going to want either more deep bedding. You want to make sure that like you can do a 3-sided shelter and then have a half right there, okay? But always keep a little bit, yes?
What about fans?
Yes, you can use a fan, but you're going to need an outlet, right, for that fan to ventilate out. You can have that fan pointed out or you can have that fan pointed in. I actually run fans in my barn in the summer, so I have one on one end and one on the other, one blowing in, one blowing out, sucking that air through. Because my new old barn, doesn't have windows.
So how deep is deep bedding? When you say deep bedding, I'm
Deep,
envisioning a 4-sided thing that's 2 feet.
So what I like to do with deep bedding is you start at the beginning of the season, right? So maybe you feed every once in a while in the barn, maybe you put a little bit of straw down in the barn. That's at the beginning of the season. You just have like an inch layer down there. And as the season goes, you're dropping more forage that they're not eating, more straw, whatever, and it just gets deeper and deeper. So by the time that winter, that deep winter hits, you probably have this much. Like I've even seen folks that will do it for a whole year and they have, a good 2 feet in there. I personally, it's personal preference. I personally will do that until lambing, and then I clean it out for lambing. Some folks like to lamb on the deep bedding. I personally don't, but that's my own personal preference. So, just because I like to clean out my stall after every girl goes in there to lamb. I like to clean that out. I put a fresh throw of lime down for antibacterial. I put new wood chips down, new fresh straw for her, and then the next one goes in. I do put straw back down, but I clean it out in between lambings. But that's a personal preference. That's one of those gray areas, right?
The stuff that you take out.
That becomes your manure, your compost.
Okay.
Yep. Don't get rid of it. All right, so we're going to talk about fencing. I don't know how much time we have. Anybody know?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Oh, geez. Okay, we got a lot to cover in 5 minutes. All right, so. Okay, so I put a comparison of fencing types here so you can understand a bit more about what they do. I'll let you reference this on your own. Here is a guide for fence spacing for sheep. If you're doing high tensile wire, this applies to goats as well. High tensile is really great for keeping things in, not really great for keeping things out. Okay, foxes, coyotes, dogs, etc. We'll go through there. Yes. 10 minutes, woo! All right, thanks, Jeremy. All right, here's my favorite. This is Electronet. This is portable. It's also kind of pricey, but it also lasts a long time if you take care of it. Now, always have this on if you have it out. 100%. Always have this on if you have it out, because what will happen is the sheep or the goats will respect it, for a while if you've got it on, and then you say, oh, well, they've learned. I don't need it on anymore. No. In about 4 days, they're going to try it again. And what will happen is they'll stick their head through because the grass is always greener on the other side. Then they're going to freak out, and they're going to get tangled, or a horn is going to get stuck, or a hoof is going to get stuck, and then they're going to end up strangling themselves to death. Okay? This happens a lot. It happens a lot. If your animals are in that pasture with that fence on, have it on at all times. Okay? I mean, just save yourself, save your animals. All right, this is what I like to use for perimeter fence. This is woven wire, also fairly expensive, but it's permanent. It's 100% permanent. You can get it at TSC, Farm and Home, whatever. This is woven wire, perimeter for your. So for your electronet, you can use that. So say you're doing that rotational grazing or that strip grazing, you can use this. Quick and easy. It's portable. You can get these little solar chargers for it, and then you can move the solar charges with your fence, so it's always hot. And you can also do a version of this that is what we call poly wire, and it comes on a wheel, and you can run 2 or 3 wires that are electrocuted as well. Not electrocuted, charged. The sheep are going to get electrocuted. Energized, thank you. That are energized as well. They get trained to that very, very quickly. You do not want to use poly wire on a perimeter fence if at all possible because, again, things can get in. Yes, this one, the woven wire. So I recommend 48 inches. So they make a sheep and goat version. This is actually a horse version. It looks like it's like the 2x4. So this is really tight. But you can do the 4x4 squares. That's the pretty much standard.
Do you make that hot too?
No, you do not need to electrify this.
If you're grazing like bigger lambs in the summer, do you need the perimeter fence?
No, you can do that electronet. Yeah. Yep. So you can get online. You can order a couple sets of that electronet. It comes anywhere between 50 and like 170 feet. And you can attach several together, and you can just move that anytime you need to move your grazing. I use Premier One, but there's other ones. I get my poly wire through a different place, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There's tons of fencing companies out there. So you can play with what you'd like. Yeah, and they are actually sheep producers. Premier One they have their own sheep production facility, so they have a lambing barn and everything on site. All right, this is what goats do. This is what goats do, folks. So the way you would curtail this is run a hot wire along the top, or a hot wire right on the inside of this. But and even then. Hold on. If any fence that I've had taken down has been taken down by a goat. You didn't take that photograph? I did not. But it looks like something that has happened in my life. All right, so let's talk about production scheduling. We have a limited amount of time left. Production scheduling is trying to determine when you want to produce those lambs. This is a handy-dandy gestation calendar. They make them for sheep and for goats that you can buy if you're learning what your gestation cycle is like. You need to ask yourself when you want to lamb or kid. You need to ask yourself that. It's a preference, personal preference, all right? So why do you want to choose that time? Is it the market? Is it the weather? Is it the grazing schedule? For me, it's all 3. I need to time my market, my weather, and my grazing. I don't like lambing in January, but I also don't like lambing in May. Because if I'm lambing in May, those moms are already on pasture, and I want to be able to kind of control that lambing a little bit more. That's a personal preference for me. Also, the market starts to fall after May, right? So you have the Easter market and so on, the spring market. So I like to lamb around March. That way, my girls are still eating hay. The lambs are not consuming any hay. By the time the lambs are weaned and ready to go out on pasture, everybody's ready to go out on pasture. And then those lambs grow on pasture. What's that? Get into that. All right, here you go. Here's the answer to your question. Woo! All right, so I say work backwards, okay? This is how long your gestation is, 147 to 150 days, depending on what you're growing. Some sheep are a little bit different. Fin sheep, for instance, are 137. So it just depends, but the average is 145 to 147 for sheep, 150 for goats. So figure that out. When you want a lamb, figure out when you want a lamb, and then that will tell you when you need to breed. Okay? So if you want a lamb in March, you need to go back 150 days minimum to figure out when you need to put those rams or bucks in. Okay? Also know that your days of estrus are 17 average. So you're generally going to get 2 estrus cycles per month. So what I recommend is putting that ram or buck in with your ewes for at least a whole month, because that way you can, if they don't get tagged on the first one, they'll hopefully get tagged on the second. The other thing I highly, highly recommend is a breeding harness. And a breeding harness is this really archaic looking thing that has a crayon attached to it. You get a crayon marker attached to it. So when that ram or buck breeds that ewe or doe, it's marked with a color. And so what I do is I put a breeding harness on my rams with one color, and I send them out with the girls. And then every day I check. And I write down who got bred that day based on who got marked that day. And I know from that day, 145 to 147 days later, I should have lambs. And I tell you, for the last 15 years, I have only been 1 to 2 days off on every single time. Okay?
Once he marks
With the crayon.
the pregnancy is guaranteed.
No. So once you do that for the first estrus, then, and everybody's gotten marked off that one color, then you can swap that color out, keep him in there for another half a month, and if he remarks somebody, you know that one didn't take on the first time. Yes, because that color will tell you that, yes.
You would not do it a third time?
I don't waste my time with the third time. If you don't get bred on 2 cycles, then you're probably not going to get bred. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. This is my planning calendar real quickly. So this is how I break out my production schedule. All right, so I have my fields, my breeding and my harvesting, my fiber production, my pelts. I told you I do everything. And my meat. All right, so I know any month of the year exactly what I need to be doing. For me, I want a lamb in March, right? So that means I need to breed in November. So that's where I start. I breed in November. I also know that I don't want any lambs in that barn when I'm breeding for the next cycle. All those lambs need to be gone from the last cycle. They need to be gone because they need to be making me money. I do not want to feed any lambs over winter. That's my personal preference. So I need to be harvesting my first lambs before the next round of lambs is born. Yes?
I noticed that in the section,
Yes.
it looks like you have a lot more days to sell.
Yeah. Exactly. So the pelts and the meat are produced at the same time, right? So when those goats or lambs are slaughtered, I'm saving all the pelts and I'm saving all the meat. The pelts go to processing. Takes about 6 months for them to get back. Then I can start selling those pelts. I harvest on farm. So as soon as I harvest, I can start packaging right away. All right, and then I can start selling. So I have a process there. So your process is going to be different for each one of you, but this gives you an idea of how to kind of think about those silos.
Direct sale.
Yes, I do value added. So you need to think about the whole thing. Think about when your pastures are being planted, when you want those ewes to be grazing or those does to be grazing, when you want to start kidding, when you want to start harvesting that meat. All of those things kind of go into play, and you can build this out and then play with it, move things around and say, oh, okay, well, maybe that'll work, maybe that won't work. All right, make it your own. All right, I think we're almost out of time, so I'm probably not going to get into meat production, but here's some other things that you need to consider with scheduling is milk production, right? So goats have a longer milk production cycle than sheep, and some animals are seasonal or aseasonal breeders, meaning some breeds can breed year-round, some breeds can only breed in the fall. That means that the temperature and the light has to drop for them to go into estrus, okay? And then what your breed purpose is. I think we'll stop it there because we're done. I have a whole bunch of other slides on meat and how to, what you need to get started with meat. Yes, you're going to get all of that.
If you want herd
Email it.